with what's going on in the West Bank, I'm really, really happy that I'm able to speak with Sari Bashi, the executive director of the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel and the author of the memoir Upside Down Love, and a human rights lawyer as well. And we had an opportunity a few years ago, right after October 7th, to talk together about Gaza. But right now, what's happening in the West Bank just seems like a real intensification of settler violence, kind of with the support of the Israeli military in many cases inside of the West Bank. You're in the West Bank right now. What has it been like just over the last few months?
Not good. So in general, since October 7th, there's been a very high level of violence. In the last year and a half, about 300 Palestinians have been killed, mostly by the Israeli military, but about 10% of them by Israeli settlers as well. The Israeli military, since October 7th, 2023, has also stepped up travel restrictions. So most Palestinian towns and villages are blocked from accessing main roads. So you need to drive like a half hour, an hour, even an hour and a half detour to get where you want to go, because most of the roads are blocked. So there's a sense of being hemmed in. And for people living in villages, it's particularly scary because there have been stepped up settler attacks, primarily on Palestinian villages, including property damage, injuries, and I'm sorry to say also fatalities.
And is it fair to say that this is happening with the support of the Israeli government, or is it just the encouragement? What is a fair way to describe the Israeli government's role in this?
Settler violence against Palestinians is state violence against Palestinians. Since 1967, the Israeli government has transferred Israeli citizens into the occupied West Bank. There are currently more than 700,000 Israeli settlers. Doing so is a war crime. It's unlawful for an occupying power to settle the occupied territory with its own citizens. The Israeli government puts them there, gives them infrastructure, water, electricity, roads, and most importantly, security. So even the outposts or farms that have not been formally authorized by the Israeli government are provided with infrastructure as well as security. So the government has been handing out vehicles and weapons to security officials within the settlements. And in many cases, those vehicles and weapons have been used to harass, hurt, and even kill Palestinians. This is not a rogue a group of people. Sometimes the attacks happen while soldiers stand by and do nothing. And sometimes the soldiers participate in the attacks and then arrest the Palestinian victims and do not enforce the law against the settlers.
What is the ultimate goal here of the Israeli government in doing this? We're talking about millions of Palestinians living on their own land in the West Bank. What does it hope to achieve?
So this government has been more transparent than previous governments in being very clear that they see the entire land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea as belonging to the Jewish people. And the settlement project is a project of ethnic cleansing. It always has been, but this government is more upfront, certainly with plans for so-called voluntary migration for folks from Gaza, and then within the West Bank, taking over more and more land, sometimes formally by seizing the land and preventing Palestinians from accessing it, and sometimes informally by allowing settlers to harass, hurt, and even kill Palestinians living on the land until they leave because they are scared and want to protect their families.
And leave to go where? If the goal is ethnic cleansing, is it the ethnic cleansing of over 2 million people?
So far, what's happened both in the West Bank and Gaza, by the way, has been that the Israeli government has been taking over more and more land. And so Palestinians are hemmed into ever smaller areas. In the West Bank, what this looks like is that farmland in villages, the outer parts of villages, Bedouin communities where people had been living in tents or in kind of informal structures, people are abandoning them.
Mhm.
because they're afraid. And so they're moving closer and closer and closer to more densely populated Palestinian areas. In Gaza, it looks similar, but in that case, the Israeli government has simply declared half of Gaza off limits to Palestinians. So
Yeah.
everybody there is squeezed into a small part of Gaza. There are also a variety of policies that encourage Palestinians to leave. So sometimes it is revoking people's status. Sometimes it's making life difficult for people. If you leave, it can be difficult to come back. But within the West Bank, the focus is really on taking over as much land as possible for Israeli Jews. And then Palestinians are hemmed into smaller areas that, for the most part, are surrounded by iron gates that block
Mhm.
access to the main roads.
Yeah, I've been to the West Bank many times, and it's not just the security concerns that Palestinians have, but daily life has become virtually impossible. There's also daily kind of humiliation rituals at checkpoints and things like that. And I've heard from so many Palestinians who, for generations, have their families have lived in the West Bank, who've told me, if I can leave, I will leave, because this is not a life I want for my own children. Would you say that's a majority view in the West Bank?
I mean, there are polls that, ask Palestinians both in Gaza and the West Bank what their plans are or what they would like to do in terms of leaving. And the numbers go up and down. I don't know that it's a majority, but the numbers do tend to be high. They're higher in Gaza because life is really hard there.
Yeah.
But I mean, these plans are not secret. The Israeli government for years has had a variety of plans designed to encourage or force Palestinians to leave the area so that more and more land would be available for Israeli Jews. And this government is very, very transparent about that.
And it's not just land, it's also resources like water. Can you describe how water plays a role in making life more difficult for Palestinians in the West Bank and easier for the settlers in those territories?
Sure. So the Israeli government controls the water resources and also limits the ability of people or regulates the ability of people to drill for groundwater and wells in
Mhm.
about 60% of the West Bank. And so the water is actually purchased by the Palestinian Authority from the Israeli government, even though the water itself comes from the whole space between the river and the sea. The allocation is very unequal. So settlements are allocated very large amounts of water, including for agriculture, including for swimming pools, and certainly for daily use. While
Mhm.
Palestinian communities, it varies whether it's a city or a village or an encampment. But Palestinians are allocated many fewer liters of water for everyday use, and certainly for farming or swimming pools. It's not just water; it's also just energy, the ability to use cellular phones, for example. So the Palestinian telecommunication companies are only allowed to use a 3G frequency, which is not very
Mhm.
fast,
Yeah.
whereas the Israeli companies are allowed much more advanced technologies. What I think is important to understand is that the Israeli government controls the space
Mhm.
between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, including Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And it allocates resources in ways that are deeply unequal,
Right.
privileging Jews over Palestinians.
What is can they, for example, you hear a lot, certainly outside the region and also within the region, that if the US, for example, just put pressure on the government of Benjamin Netanyahu or whoever the prime minister in office is, that there is still a chance for Palestinians to live in dignity and self-determination, and that a two-state solution is still a possibility. Is it true that the United States has that much leverage over Israel? Uh, can you explain, people who say this, are they correct to say this?
Yes, they are. And I think it's really important because I think it's important for US citizens to take responsibility for the crimes that their government is complicit in or is supporting. And so on that front, the US government is providing the Israeli government with weapons, political backing, as well as economic support. And that is allowing the Israeli government to commit abuses against Palestinians. So in terms of what it could do, it could stop supplying weapons that are being used to commit war crimes. It could, for example, enforce an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who just visited Washington, D.C. It could stop blocking UN security resolutions that have the potential to actually uphold Palestinian rights in Israel-Palestine. There's a lot the U.S. could do. And I'm encouraged to see that there are shifts in the way that U.S. citizens are viewing U.S. policy toward Israel-Palestine. That public opinion shift hasn't yet translated into significant policy changes, but I believe that it will and it should.
Yeah, we see it especially among younger Americans as well. We see it in the policy proposals and promises of more progressive Democrats running for office as well. But that is probably a generational shift, which is not something that we'll see overnight. But I guess my question about who's in office and whether or not it matters, I just think back, for example, to the Oslo Accords and how even at a time when we all thought that this two-state solution was going to happen, that there were agreements, that there was goodwill on the part of the Israeli government, still we saw settlements being built and settlement expansion tolerated at best and sometimes encouraged as well. So will it change? For example, if there are elections in October in Israel, will it change if there's a new party in power?
So I run an anti-torture group, and I can say that the national security minister, who, among other things, is in charge of the prison system, has been particularly abusive in terms of the policies he's put forward for Palestinian prisoners. And so if somebody else takes his job, things certainly could get better at the level of, conditions being somewhat better. And that's important. That matters. But I don't think we're going to see significant change because the policy of controlling the entire space, but treating Jews better than Palestinians, has been a policy not just of a single government, but of the Israeli system of government. And that has been consistent, certainly within Israel through different governments, and support for it has been consistent within the United States in both Democratic and Republican leaders. And so the problem is not the government, the problem is the system of government, the regime. And here I really am encouraged because I'm a writer, so I know how important stories can be. And I think maybe understandably for a long time, the story in the United States was that there's a conflict, it's an ethnic tribal conflict between Jews and Muslims, and there were all kinds of confusions about whether it's between Arabs and Jews, even though half the Jews in Israel are partly Arab. And so if there's a conflict, we need peace and let's have a two-state solution. That's not how I see it. And I think in the United States, more people are starting to see it differently. There is conflict. The problem is that there is a regime that is oppressing and abusing people. And we need to make that stop. And once we do that, then certainly we can work for peace and certainly the conflict levels would go down. But there are not two symmetrical parties that are engaged in conflict. There is armed conflict, but there overall is a government that is controlling 7.5 million Jews and 7.5 million Palestinians and creating a regime of Jewish supremacy over Palestinians that needs to be dismantled. And I'm encouraged that more and more people in the United States are starting to understand that. And that's where the change can begin.
Yeah, the narrative certainly has changed post October 7th because of what's happened in Gaza, and people have had an opportunity to educate themselves on the history and how we got here. Gaza, by the way, and I remind viewers and people who follow my work on social media platforms, has still been the Israeli government has still not allowed an independent international journalist to cover Gaza, which is unprecedented in the history of conflict reporting. What is public opinion like about the West Bank? I'm just going to leave Gaza out of it for now, but about what's going on in the West Bank within Israel among Israeli Jews. Are they exposed to what's going on? And if they are, and when they are, what are their thoughts about it?
So it's important for me to say that there is a small but really admirable group of Israeli activists who know exactly what's going on, and they are
Mhm.
putting their bodies out there to try to make it stop. For the
Right.
last few years, there has been an explosion in the number of Israeli Jews volunteering for what we call protective presence. Just nonviolent being present in villages to try to deter settler violence. And more people are also being educated because they're seeing it with their own eyes and they understand what's happening. But having said that, no, the mainstream view within the Israeli media, within the Israeli public, is that what is happening in the West Bank is terrorism against Israeli Jews. And a good example is an attack that took place about a week ago
Yeah.
when settlers came to a Palestinian village and harassed people, brought weapons. There was a conflict. 5 Palestinians and 2 Israeli Jews were killed. And the way it was covered in the media was that Palestinian terrorists attacked Israeli settlers, even though they were in their village trying to defend their village. So
Mhm.
that's a sense of how badly warped I think the narrative is within Israel.
Yeah. And why is that? Is that because, I mean, I often hear people tell me, even journalists who've come back from the region, they say, well, Israelis are not aware really of what's going on in Gaza, for example. And I find that quite surprising. Yes, on Israeli TV, I rarely see Gaza covered unless it's to kind of lionize the Israeli military and its actions against, quote, terrorists in Gaza. But people have phones. They're educated. They've been to university. I mean, they're like any other country. I mean, they have access to this information. Are they really not aware of what's going on?
In Israel, and also I think in the United States and in a lot of places in the world, the problem is not really a lack of information. The problem is the story people tell themselves around that information.
Mhm.
So within Gaza, when there's an awareness that, tens of thousands of people have been killed by the Israeli military, and the narrative is that they were all terrorists. And if they weren't terrorists, then it's Hamas's fault that they were killed. So that's the
Right.
story. So the facts are there, the basic facts. But the story that people tell is different than the story I would tell, which is
Yeah.
that tens of thousands of people were killed, primarily civilians. Absolutely. Hamas failed to adequately protect civilians by locating, in many cases, personnel and weapons in civilian areas. And the Israeli government committed massive war crimes in directly
Yeah.
targeting civilians and in also conducting other kinds of illegal attacks, and most importantly, in terms of not allowing food and other basics to get in, which is also what killed a lot of people. So it's a question of what the narrative is that you see. And for Israeli Jews, and I think for a lot of people in the United States, there still is a very deep historical trauma from the Holocaust, from
Mhm.
centuries of Jews being a persecuted minority. And it can be difficult to understand that today, as of 2026, in Israel, Israeli Jews are in control of the Israeli government. And the Israeli government is abusing power, not because they're Jewish, but because most governments, if given an opportunity to abuse power without being checked, will do
Mhm.
so. And
Mhm.
so if we could just get rid of these narratives about Jews and Palestinians and ethnic conflict and biblical dictates, and
Mhm.
just see that there is a government that needs to be reined in and follow the same international law rules, including respecting human rights, as any other government, then we can start to have a rational conversation and understand the facts as they really are.
Yes, but the problem is the two sides, if you want to call it that, are not agreeing on the facts. But what you mentioned about the uh, the views of Israeli Jews on Gaza, there was a poll in 2025. 62% of Israelis say there are no innocents in Gaza. I mean, this is something that time and again I see in polls. And I suppose when you're a journalist and you deal in facts, it's difficult to understand how two-thirds of the population of Israel would say something like that and believe it. How do you explain that?
We're in a bad place. We are in a very hard place in Israel Palestine. It's difficult to communicate how broken each society has become and is becoming. decades of violence, decades of a racially imposed regime, of one racial group being treated better than another, have dehumanized people. And what I can say, I believe we will change this system of government and transform it into a rights respecting democracy. It won't be tomorrow, it'll take time, but we will do it. And when we do, we will have a lot of work to do in rehabilitating society and in rehabilitating people. And it's important for me to say that most societies do not voluntarily give up on privilege. So we should understand that there is a strong and wonderful small group of Israeli activists working to transform this system of government, but it's going to have to, it needs help from outside. And where the US is concerned, to stop harming, to just take very basic steps to stop propping up what is essentially an abusive system of government.
But just, I want to ask you about the West Bank where you are. It doesn't look like it's going in that direction now. And how life must be extremely difficult. I'm not Palestinian. I don't live there, and yet I witness it, and it's a very difficult thing to witness when I can stay in a car at a checkpoint, but my Palestinian colleague has to exit the car, and in this, as we mentioned earlier, humiliation ritual, cross the checkpoint on foot. For example, just one of many examples. It must be difficult to endure this day to day.
I mean, I don't think it's an accident that a lot of people in the West Bank want to leave. And what I want to say about the checkpoints is that certainly there are checkpoints where people are humiliated, but more often than not, people are not going through checkpoints because it's just a closed iron gate. People are not traveling. So tens of thousands of workers from the West Bank who relied on jobs in Israel are not being allowed to come in. Family visits are cut off. Visits for prayer and other needs are cut off. There aren't that many people being allowed to even pass checkpoints. And most of the checkpoints these days are within the West Bank, blocking off roads, blocking off access, making it difficult for daily life inside the West Bank to take place. So yes, it's very difficult. There are good people doing good work. There are Palestinian and Israeli activists who are working to build a better future, a future of true democracy. It will take time, but when I see public opinion shifts in the United States, when I see some measures taken, for example, by European governments in terms of sanctioning violent settlers and other measures, I see that change is on the way. It will take time.